My name's Julia Arden. I'm the curator of the exhibition, Oceania Distance and Diversity. The exhibition is a regional exhibition supported by SAQA, Studio Art Quilts Associates, which is a mainly American organization, but it does have members in all other parts of the world, including our region, Australia and New Zealand. In 2021, the annual conference for SAQA was to feature the Oceania region. And so it seemed appropriate that we would set up an exhibition that could be virtual at that conference and also then travel around New Zealand and Australia. A small committee worked on the subject title for the exhibition, and two of the features of our very wide geographical area were distance and diversity, and so that became the title. The exhibition was juried by two international jurors, Martha Wolfe from the USA and Norma Slabbert from New Zealand. Both jurors were impressed by the sense of place that came through the selected works and how the artist statements illustrated the respect for land informing the subject matter. The exhibition opened in May 2021 at the New Zealand National Quilt Organisation's show in Rotorua. It then moved to Gallery Estuary Arts, which is north of Auckland, and then to Refinery Arts in Nelson, and finally the Fo Guang Yuan Art Gallery in Christchurch for the whole of November and December. That was the end of the New Zealand section of the tour. Thanks to the sterling efforts of our South Australian member, Zara Zanatino, we were finally able to get the exhibition shipped to Australia in time for the Hughes Gallery showing in May 2022. And then it went to the Joel Gallery in Melbourne, Kyabram Town Hall, and its final showing is now the one at Bunbury Regional Art Gallery. The works are all 60 centimetres wide by 40 centimetres deep, and this has allowed the exhibition to be shown in smaller venues than any larger works would have needed. We produced a colour catalogue of the exhibition, and that's it there. Can you see that? Which sold out during the New Zealand tour, but it's available to view online, and I'm sure that you will have that link available to you. The members of the Oceania region comprise many well-established artists as well as some developing artists. And this exhibition is a testament to the quality of work being produced in Australia and New Zealand. My work was called Pacific Discoveries. This exhibition title included the words distance and diversity, and I chose to cover both ideas in my work. Our largest country, Australia, covers about 4,000 kilometres from west to east, and the ocean and islands that make up the remainder are almost 8,000 kilometres. So this is a huge, huge area which obviously have very diverse landscape and culture. I chose to interpret the region in vertical bands, mainly corresponding to lines of longitude from 100 degrees east to 140 degrees west. Australia is the only country in the region that had Indigenous people. For all of the other islands, including New Zealand, my home, the populations arrived by boat over hundreds of years. In that time, migration was not one event. People travelled from one island to another, and they took with them their cultural symbols, motifs, and forms of decoration. In some places, people used the bark of trees, in some woven grasses, and many used local earth and clay to make the colours that we associate with them today. Overall, it was the Pacific Ocean that influenced the lives of those travellers and settlers, and I chose a mariner's compass and stars to remind us that navigation was key to the success of the journey. Over the last 4 or 5 years, I have been using commercial fabrics almost exclusively, rather than creating my own by dyeing or surface design. I've also moved from representational art to abstract geometric works. I find it quite liberating to use printed fabrics in combinations that speak to me about ideas. I do a lot of research. I'm a very deliberate artist, but I find abstraction allows the viewer to interpret.
Hello, I'm Lyndon Lancaster, and I live in Northern Victoria, Australia, on a sheep farm. My piece is called Gilgai. During the past few years, my husband and I have found time to go for nature walks on the tracks near our farm in Northern Victoria. As part of our local wildflower group, since I retired from teaching, I'd already been becoming more knowledgeable about our local flora. This piece was developed in response to a chance discovery in the Barmah Forest, where we came across a gilgai, which is a depression in which the ground that collects ephemeral water. This small patch contained a surprising diversity of shape and form. There are 7 different varieties of wildflowers depicted here, but there were many more in the instance that we saw them. Fancy living next to this forest for so long and never knowing about or thinking to look for such treasures. To begin with, I fused the dark, abstract shapes in the background to form a structure and decided on the focal area, which would be the yellow flowers on the lower left. The following plants would be added in a profusion, with the ribbon weed leading the eye into the background. I love using sheer fabrics because of their transparency and the way that you can layer them up to achieve different effects. For example, the shadows on the star cudweed at the back, made from very thin cotton, adds depth to the work. The spotty sheer on the bottom right gives interest without interrupting the design. And the dark background shapes, which I mentioned earlier, that are made of painted silk organza, anchor the piece without adding too much weight. Silk organza is a wonderful fabric to work with. It looks delicate, but it's quite robust and can be dyed, painted, cut, fused, and stitched quite happily. I wanted to keep this piece light and ephemeral in keeping with the nature of the gilgai. Another technique I have employed is the use of dispersed dyes. This is a great way to add depth and complexity to a man-made fabrics such as polyester. I use this to make the round leaves of the wavy marshwort shiny and look like they've been kissed by water. I first discovered this from an article about a British artist called Amanda Richardson. Her work is absolutely gorgeous and would be well worth looking up. Using dispersed dyes is pretty easy. Firstly, you paint the dyes onto paper, wait until it dries, then transfer it onto the fabric with an iron. I've used a variety of other fabrics for the appliques, which include vintage polyester, sari silks, dyed cotton, and velvet. These were all stitched down using free motion machine work and mostly variegated polyester thread. This was an enjoyable project to work on. My husband and I still shake our heads that we could have lived out our lives never imagining that such delicate beauty existed practically in our own backyard. And now here I am sharing it with you.
My name is Linda Steele and I called my quilt Reef Revelations. I'd been making a series of quilts about the Great Barrier Reef since 2015. When I began my quilts, they were all about how beautiful and colourful the coral reefs were. As I read more and watched documentaries, I worried about how the reefs were under threat. My quilts started to explore coral bleaching and the dangers of plastic in our oceans. In the end, I went back to making quilts about how spectacular and magical the Great Barrier Reef is and how lucky we are to have it. When I read that the topic for the exhibition was distance and diversity, I thought about the coral reef and how beautiful and diverse it is. I remembered hearing about the Great Barrier Reef in primary school. I read about the wonderful colours and the exotic tropical fish, but our textbooks were in black and white, so I could only imagine what it really looked like. Queensland seemed very far away and distant to a small girl in Adelaide. I knew that I had the perfect theme for the Sakwa Oceania Distance and Diversity exhibition. I needed a photo of a young girl reading a book, and we were in lockdown. So I rang my daughter, who lived further away than the 5 kilometres we were allowed to travel, and asked her to take photos of my granddaughter reading a book. They were delighted to have a task and took the photos that day. My idea was to have a coral reef swirling around the girl in her imagination as she read the book. Because the required quilt size wasn't very big, her face had to be relatively small, so I decided to paint the face rather than deal with the tiny pieces of fabric. I used Caran d'Ache Neo Colour 2 water-soluble crayons. I wanted the colour to be permanent on fabric, so I mixed the crayons with aloe vera gel. The aloe vera gel not only made the colour permanent, it made the crayons easier to handle. Painting that face was a very nerve-wracking day. I rubbed the crayons onto the shiny side of freezer paper and added aloe vera gel to make it more paint-like. I started very lightly and gradually added more colour until I was happy with the result. Then I appliqued the hair and clothes with fabric. For many years I made crazy quilts, and the hand and machine embroidery that I used then is perfect for making coral. I stitched the coral with colonial knots and various other stitches using all the thread that I'd accumulated over the years. Stitching the coral on felt first made it a very portable activity to do while watching TV or being at sewing groups. I make the background first with fabric that reminds me of water and rocks, and then create all the components. You always need more coral and fish than you think you need, so I have to make a lot. I like to use batik fabric for the fish so it doesn't fray, and it comes in so many lovely colours. When I've finished preparing the coral onto felt, I cut around the shapes and machine sew them into place using the sewing machine, then add further embroidery around the edges. I also make the coral with a wash-away fabric and sometimes add hand stitches on top or add beads or add fabrics underneath. When I've finished making all the components, I place them on the background that I've prepared to try and make a cohesive composition. It always goes through an awkward stage and I have to work hard with further hand and machine stitching to combine it all together. Finally, I machine quilt it with silk thread in a sort of watery pattern. Thank you.
Well, I'm Zara Zanatino, and my piece was fascinating foraminifera. It was a really engaging topic for us to join into in Oceania. So, yeah, it just really appealed to me. So my work that I produced is actually based on my former background as a biologist, studying the foraminifera, which are these little unicellular creatures that live in oceans and brackish waters, and I had studied them once, and they've just held a fascination for me. So I thought, because they were such wonderful environmental indicators of distance and diversity, and the planet and all the rest, I just thought it was potentially an interesting topic. I'm so glad I was juried in by Norma and Martha, and yeah, it's sort of begun the journey of putting my work in exhibitions this last couple of years, and it's wonderful to see it travelling around. The piece itself, look, the colours aren't realistic. I'd hate people to think that foraminifera are all these bright colours, but they can be when they're stained and looked under the microscope. And the little creatures themselves, what you're actually seeing isn't the living creature, it's the dead creatures. They are all examples of the morphology of these little grain-sized little creatures, and when they die, that's what they look like. But when they're alive, all of those little apparent shells have tiny little holes in them, and their body, their single cell body, oozes out through all of those holes, and that's how they feed, and they float around in the water, and yeah, and their structures actually can indicate to scientists where they'll find everything from petrol underneath the Earth's surface to the temperature of the water, how it's changed. And yeah, I just find that fascinating. I don't know what people think when they look at my work. They probably think I was on drugs or something, but I don't. I just love showing the wonder of creation. So that was my piece, and it was achieved using a whole lot of free motion stitching, which is where you guide the material yourself, not the machine stitching. And sometimes I work from the front of the work, sometimes from the back, invisibly. But overall, I liked adding all that lovely texture and dimension to the work as well. And I had a lot of fun making it. So thank you for showing off my work.
I'm Marilyn George, and my quilt is called Ngā Kāinga o Mangawero, which means Homes of Mangawero. under the mountain, kei raro I te maunga Ruapehu, under the mountain. The inspiration for my artwork was my new great-granddaughter, Mahinarangi Hakaraya, and another generation. The origin and structure of this design is one which had festered in my subconscious for almost 50 years, and it was a drawing from my 1974 journal. I grew up in the bush between two rivers, where there was a colony of bats in the backyard and all sorts of insects and bird life and animal life, which I loved. Recently, in the last few years, I've been working on a study of the river near my home called Mangawero, and that means red stream. It flows from the slopes of our mountain volcano, which is 9,175 feet or 2,797 metres high. The river flows for 70 kilometres into the Turkina River, and then it flows into the sea. Rivers are important in Māoridom. There are spiritual connections to both mountains, we call maunga, and rivers, we call awa. And I want to express that idea of the spirituality as I was preparing my work, which started as an idea for a book that could teach my moko grandchildren to love the environment and to understand the links in the ecosystem, especially in the bush along the river where we live. The trees that I've depicted in the quilt, and I often use in my work a cruciform shape. So these trees are from real names and the largest in our forest, and they provide homes for animal life of the sky, the land, and the waterways. And the trees in my artist statement are called Rimu, Rata, Tōtara, Kahikatea, and Kaikawaka. The trees and animal life have their own complicated web of relationships, alliances and networks, and they need each other. And with this quilt, I'm hoping that I will pass on my love and care for the environment to people who look at the work and to the next generation. Kia ora.
I'm Marie Mitchell, conservation advocate and mixed media textile artist. I was inspired by an aerial view of the West Australian wheat belt to create a series of works addressing the environmental issues resulting from industrial chemical agriculture practices. Fragile Skin is one in the series that highlights the issues of land degradation, lost soil fertility, and erosion. Chemical fertilizers, pesticides, and herbicides have killed most of the microorganisms that live in the soil and make it fertile. Then it dries out and is blown away in the wind or washed away when it rains. I find the fact that half the topsoil on the planet has been lost in the last 150 years as scary as climate change. We take the soil beneath our feet for granted, so I use transparency to symbolize its fragility. I started with a base of tulle and added scraps of gauze bandage, old mosquito net, silk, and cotton fabrics that had been dyed with rust or natural dyes. To rust dye some of the pieces, I wrapped the fabric around tin cans to create the lines to represent sown fields. Most of the pieces were torn to depict soil fragility. The white patches allude to the many salt lakes found in the area, while the green rectangles illustrate the remnants of the original native bushland. They have straight edges to show how the original landscape has been carved up and constricted along arbitrary man-made divisions. The damage doesn't have to continue. I'm not a farmer, but I am a consumer with a vote that has power to influence. I believe change doesn't have to come from the top down. I can demand soil security legislation from my local politicians. I can ask how my food was grown and actively seek to purchase food from farmers using regenerative agriculture systems. I hope my work inspires others to join me in supporting the transition to a more sustainable and circular economy.